The clock's running out on December deal drops at Lowe's, but there's still time to wrap up something they'll love. Shop great gifts under $50, like the DeWalt Elite Series 100-piece bit set. Plus, if you order by 2 p.m., you get same-day delivery by 8 p.m. Shop December deal drops while you can. Lowe's, we help, you save.
Okay, only 10 more presents to wrap. You're almost at the finish line. But first... There, the last one. Enjoy a Coca-Cola for a pause that refreshes.
Beer is often referred to as liquid bread, which makes sense as both rely on the same primary ingredients, cereal grains being one of them and yeast being the other. In regards to the latter, brewers have a wide variety of yeast strains available that are known to produce unique flavor characteristics, though bakers have, well, far fewer options, though curiously they all come from the same general family. This is the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and joining me on this episode to chat about the use of bread yeast, baker's yeast, also known as brewer's yeast, to ferment beer is contributor Will Lovell.
Yeah, good old Fleischmann's yeast, if we're going to throw in maybe a promo for any brand of yeast, because I can't think of a brand of bread yeast other than Fleischmann's. But I like to kind of think of the idea that back before Louis Pasteur was involved with all this, microscopes and trying to separate out all these different strains of yeast, that, everything, whether it was beer or bread, probably had a little bit of a mixed culture going on and a little bit of a funk happening to it. And then somehow we separated all that out, and now we have kind of these pure Saxavicia strains that we use for both baking and brewing. And I think it's kind of fun to think about all that history that was involved through that. But, thanks, Louis, for getting that sour out of there.
Yeah, I have a feeling this is going to be one of those topics most brewers have thought about, though few have actually tried, which is certainly the case for me, and I'm looking forward to digging into it with you today, Will. All right, if you're a fan of this show and you'd like to receive a reward for your support, please consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy, where you make a small pledge and receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique perks from YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to either a monthly live brew day with a Brewlosophy contributor or a Q&A session. Learn more about all of the rewards we offer for your support over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. Another really easy way to support us is by using the links found at brewlosophy.com/support when you're shopping online. Your experience won't change at all, and we get a little kickback for the referral. And finally, please let us know what you think about this show by rating and reviewing it in Apple Podcast or wherever it is you listen to podcasts. Thanks to everybody who has already taken the time to do this. Feedback is brought to you by Clawhammer Supply, who offer brewers various options for high-quality, reasonably priced electric brewing rigs in various voltages and sizes. I've used their 120-volt system for 5-gallon batches, as well as their 240-volt 10-gallon setup. Both are awesome. Clawhammer Supply really does put the effort into ensuring their systems do exactly as they are intended to do in as efficient a way as possible. But if you're not ready to jump to electric just yet, they also sell 10 and 20-gallon brew-in-a-bag homebrewing starter kits. Whatever it is you're looking for, do yourself a favor and visit clawhammersupply.com. We're confident you're going to love their stuff just as much as we do. Listener Charlie Johnson wrote in with some feedback after listening to us talk about session beers recently. Charlie said, I loved the episode on your experiences with session beers. As a Brit, I love a good sesh myself, so keeping the ABV on the lower side is always a sensible decision. One thing you didn't discuss in detail in the episode was the choice of yeast strain. Hey, apropos. We all know that yeast attenuation varies from strain to strain, with those at the high end of the scale being able to efficiently ferment a range of sugars, for example, glucose, fructose, maltose, and maltotriose, while at the opposite end are strains that are not capable of fermenting all of these types of sugar compounds, specifically those that are maltotriose negative. One notable example is the Laumand Windsor strain, which is great for brewing those sessionable English ales, but I see no reason to use it in more modern styles. What do you say, Will?
Yeah, I would think that most English styles would be kind of associated with those session beers, just because the English, with all the bitters and, dark malts and all those kind of like sessionable styles, they all come kind of from that same vein. I also think obviously I'll probably went through all the great things with mash temperatures, things to play with. So you're not really limited to some of those Windsor strains or English strains out there. But, it definitely is another lever that you can kind of push or pull depending on what you want out of it. And so I think it's definitely worth mentioning, and a great nod. I think the cask ale scene in the UK is amazing. I know it's probably not as hip and young anymore as it used to be because it's a very old tradition at this point. But man, as an American, I love cask ale, and I love that cask ale scene over there in the UK. Please keep that going for us, guys. That's one of the special things about going over there.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. And yeah, Charlie, I have to admit that the yeast thing didn't really cross my mind as a major aspect of making a good session beer, in part because my personal experience involves using just a handful of yeast strains for session beers. 3470 for lagers, Chico ale yeast, for ales, maybe the fuller strain, which is like A09 Pub from Imperial Yeast. I haven't really dove into the impact that different yeasts might have when making a lower ABV beer. But as, based on your feedback, I was thinking, there's a couple of strains out there that I know have interesting impacts on the way beer is perceived. For example, the popular French Saison strain from Yeast, I forget what number that is. But to me, it doesn't matter how big the beer is, how small it might be. It really does seem to impart this kind of creamy mouthfeel, this lusciousness, on the palate that I feel would be really, really beneficial in a lower ABV beer. So obviously that's a strain you're not going to use to make just a regular, American pale ale or something like that. But if there are strains out there that are known for doing that kind of a thing, I'm completely with you. I am not a big fan of that Windsor strain. I've used it a few times in just your kind of classic English ales and was never terribly pleased with the outcome, but I have friends who absolutely love it. My go-to is that fuller strain, that A09 Pub or WLP 002. But yeah, I think yeast is an important aspect of it. I think we probably just kind of ignored it because our experiences on that episode just were so, minimal, and we don't want to steer anybody the wrong way. But thank you so much for that feedback. If you have show feedback, you could send it to feedback@brulosophy.com. or drop us a note on social media. All right, be sure to pick up your Brulosophy merch, which you can find by visiting brulosophy.com/shop. We're offering more options than we ever have before, from t-shirts, hoodies, and hats to fanny packs, shorts, coffee mugs, tank tops, mobile phone cases, and stickers, among other things. We've done our best to keep prices reasonable, and international shipping is now available. Again, you can head over to brulosophy.com/shop. Click one of the product images on that page, which will redirect you to our Dashery store, or you can go there directly, brulosophy.dashery.com. We've put a link in the description of this episode.
Okay. Only 10 more presents to wrap. You're almost at the finish line. But first... There, the last one. Enjoy a Coca-Cola for a pause that refreshes.
I've got Dan Morgan here on the pod. Say hi, Dan.
Hey, how's it going today?
It's going good, man. Tell us who you are and what you do.
I'm Dan Morgan. I'm an attorney and a managing partner at Morgan & Morgan, which is America's largest injury law firm.
That's pretty awesome. Why do you guys think you win so many cases?
The insurance companies and other companies that we go against know that we're going to take it to the end, that we believe in the case. So we fight for every dollar, and we're not afraid to go that extra mile for our clients.
Are insurance companies actually afraid of you guys?
We don't bluff. We take it to trial, and we are not strangers of getting very, very, very large verdicts.
Awesome. So how does someone get in contact with Morgan & Morgan? What would I do if I got into an accident?
Probably the easiest way is dialing pound law. That's pound 529 from your cell phone. And our call center is always waiting to take your call. 24/7, 365.
Wow. Dan Morgan from Morgan & Morgan, America's largest injury law firm. Thanks for coming by the show.
Thanks for having me.
Visit forthepeople.com for an office near you. We all know that designing recipes is really fun, and doing it well is so much easier with good software. We at Brewlosophy recently made the switch to Brewfather, and honestly, y'all, we could not be happier. Brewfather utilizes the latest technology to bring you the most robust cloud-based recipe design software that can be accessed anywhere, on your phone, tablet, desktop, and even offline. It also works seamlessly with numerous third-party devices to make it easier to monitor every step of your brew. I know change can be difficult, but trust me when I say you need to go to brewfather.app today to try it out for yourself. That's brewfather.app.
There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. Take some cereal grains, crush them up, add some water, toss in some yeast, and what do you get? Well, if you're a baker, you get a loaf of bread, but if you're a brewer, you get a batch of beer. The similarities between these two delectable edibles are uncanny, and each have actually been around for a very long time.
Yes, a tale as old as time, as they would say. But so yeast has been around for a long time. There are evidence of humans were grinding wild grains into paste and cooking it on hot stones over 30,000 years ago, which is pretty impressive. The ancient Egyptians from around 3,000 years back are credited with discovering leavened bread, likely through accidental fermentation that occurred when wild yeast from the environment came into contact with dough. But this led to what we call sourdough starters. So a lot of us are kind of inadvertently making went there too with their inadvertent leavened bread, and now we get our own little cultures and keep them in our fridge and give them names. So that's its own thing.
Well, I don't name my starter. I that's one of the things that I refuse to do for whatever reason. I love that people have fun. I know.
So lame.
I'm also just not that clever, so I see these people come up with the funniest freaking names for their starters. You know what I will say? This is a complete side thing. I'm all good with like naming your starter if that's what you want to do. What I don't understand is why people like anthropomorphize their starter and refer to it as her or him. Like your starter doesn't have a sex. Anyways, I'll leave that alone. I do think it's fascinating though that you've got these, this evidence of people making, again, very loosely described as bread, but mixing ground up, grain, so flour of some sort with water and then heating it up on these hot stones to consume, right, for nutrient reasons. And then it took some 27,000 years more for people to start to actually try to control or tame whatever it was that was leavening. And when we say leavening, we're just talking about a bread that has yeast in it, that's going to produce that CO2 to fluff it up a bit, right? For us to kind of tame it and start using it for our very specific purposes of making bread. Fascinating to me. But you start to think about all of this, and it's hard for me not to view almost as like, siblings, the advent of bread with beer. And, we call beer liquid bread often. And I think these are the reasons why.
Yeah. I think it's amazing. I mean, how magical must have been to like the Sumerians and the Egyptians who were out there making this stuff way back when that this just worked, right? Like, and they just took it for granted this just worked. Like either the gods allowed it to happen or some other special person allowed it to happen. That's pretty amazing to me. So, so I guess when we get to microbiology, the Sumerians, they didn't have microbiological understanding of fermentation, but they were the ones that kind of started sleuthing out that frothy film sitting on top of that liquid had something special in it. We might call it crossin, and then bakers started realizing that they could make less acidic and better bread if they just use that foam from fermenting beer, which is contained, less bacteria in it. So really, like, these two, bread and beer, have been interlinked. So it's no wonder that when Louis Pasteur came around, who I kind of gave a nod to earlier in the header of this show, that he was able to separate out this Sac Cerevisiae strain and give us brewers / bread yeast, because again, that's kind of the same strain that we're using for both. And And I mean, maybe he's not directly responsible. I don't know. Did Louis actually separate it out, or did one of his proteges? But obviously the invention of the microscope definitely led to that. So it's pretty cool that he was able to do that for all of us, and definitely cool for all those lager strain brewers as well, who we won't be talking about very much in this show.
Well, when I think about how this must have gone down, right? You had these ancient Sumerians who are making this beer. Now, again, the beer that these people were making 3,000 years ago, it almost certainly didn't taste like the IPA that you're sipping right now. You know what I mean? But it was a very unique beverage that was designed almost, solely as a way to consume, water and nutrient-rich water, really, that wasn't going to make you sick because of the process of fermentation, reducing the risk of other stuff in there, making its way into your body and making you sick. So somebody at some point was probably, this is how I imagine it went down. They're looking at this thing going, well, we know that they're using the same grains that we use to make this, hardtack bread. We know that stuff creates bubbles. Wonder what happens if we just mix in a little bit of that krausen, that fluffy stuff on the top of this beer stuff, into our dough. Let's see what happens. I mean, they had thousands and thousands of years to refine this idea and process, of course, but eventually it turned into leavened bread, all because of beer. I mean, that to me is the part that is so interesting. I looked in so many different places on the history of fermentation in general and leavening, the leavening of bread as well. And it all is tied to beer. It's that, like, everywhere I could find, discussing this rad discovery, 3,000 years ago, bread is intimately linked with the fact that people were using krausen from beer to leaven it. That just blows my mind. I think that's such a fascinating connection.
Well, I mean, again, if you're a domesticated, kind of sedentary society that's domesticated either barley or wheat, I mean, obviously you're going to be sitting around making probably beer and bread from those things if you're sitting around and got the time to play with it. So it makes a lot of sense from that historical perspective. And so we thank you all for your trial and error. And we also thank Louis Pasteur for kind of taking out the trial and error, because that gets us to where we can kind of play with some of these more modern brewing yeasts, where we can actually, realize that different yeast gives us different flavor characteristics, especially in beer, but also in how they react with bread. And so, brewers' yeast are things that we want to coax out different flavors. We want them to be efficient, but we also don't want craziness. Whereas bread yeast is really just there to create as much CO2 as humanly possible and make that dough rise really fast. And so the Fleischmann's yeast you're buying in the store is specifically engineered to sit there at kind of a warm temp, create a bunch of CO2, and make that stuff rise as fast as you can, so you can turn out bread loaves all day. So I think that's pretty awesome. So it's a little different, or a departure from the probably more sourdough or ish cultures of old, even though those are making a comeback with people like you and my wife, Marshall. But for those of us that are switching over to actual modern bread yeast, we can crank out a loaf of bread really fast, like in the same day. It's pretty awesome.
Yeah. Oh, without a doubt. My wife just went and bought a jar of Fleischmann's for holiday baking. I mean, it's, I'm the sourdough baker in our household, but her thing is there are like traditional Latvian breads that she wants to make while we're home for the holidays, and she doesn't want to have to wait and go through the process that we might for our weekly loaves that I make, right? So cool. I appreciate it. I think it's great. When we think about what Louis Pasteur did, right? So this was not long ago at all. I mean, we're talking mid-19th century, something like that. So middle of the 1800s, the scientist Louis Pasteur discovers this ability to go in and actually isolate different microorganisms, and that's how we got this pure yeast that doesn't have, that he isolated it. Again, he pulled it away from any other microbes, which might potentially impact, the way that yeast is going to work and whatever it's pitched into. Now, I've got a sourdough starter that I made myself 2 years ago, and the all you do is you mix flour and water, and then you keep removing a portion and putting more flour and water in there, and whatever microbes happen to make its way into that starter start to go to work. If you go and smell my starter right now, especially when it's hungry, if I haven't fed it in a couple of days, it will almost smell like acetone. Well, you think about acetone, that is a off flavor in beer, right? There's a lot of carryover here. what was happening with the beers that were being brewed by the Sumerians, right? They're just setting it out and praying to Ninkasi and hoping that, Ninkasi does the thing. And they're able to get a good beer out of this process because they didn't understand what Louis Pasteur did understand. And again, I find this really fascinating. What Louis Pasteur did is he was able to make it so that we could look at yeast as being this relatively easy to understand, microorganism that we could put to work for us, as opposed to hoping that it lands on our beer or it lands on in our flour and our bread, our dough. And I think that's really cool. So the fact that, again, now with Louis Pasteur's discovery, we're able to take just isolated fresh yeast with nothing else in it, put that into a dough. It makes the dough rise faster. We can turn a loaf around faster, but we can also take that yeast, throw it into some wort. It ferments the beer cleaner. It's just easier process to do it that way. Do you potentially miss out on some other aspect? Yeah, that's why a lot of us are back into making sourdough bread. We like the kind of natural aspect of the fermentation of that dough. In brewing, though, do we want that? I mean, I think that's part of the question, is that, for modern brewers, we want to have as much control over the process and the flavor and, all the characteristics of that beer as we possibly can.
Yeah. So I think it's kind of interesting. There's a brewery in Bruges or Brugge, Belgium, that De Habman, that makes Bruges Zout, which kind of always to me has like a very small, like almost sour character to it. And so I've been really curious if they use like the same kind of more historical culture that they would have used way back in the day versus like switching over to a pure yeast strain, because I would imagine that everything back then had kind of a slight acidity or sourness to it if you let it sit around, especially just in storing vessels and the cooling tanks that they use that were up at the top of the whatever like high tower in there that they pumped up there just to like have it cool and like that whatever wild stuff is blowing across it. So I can only imagine kind of like all things were probably a little smoky and a little sour way back in the day for all things bread and beer. Just because of the nature of the way they could malt the grains or bake the bread, and then the different cultures they got into it. But thanks to that Louis Pasteur guy, the French, he did it right there, and so now we have the ability to use crisp, clean lager strains, wonderful ale strains, and modern malting methods mean we don't have to deal with the smoke unless we want to. Although if you haven't baked a loaf of bread on a like a Kamado style grill or something, like it is amazing to get that little smoky character with it if you've never done it before. But yes, that's awesome.
I'll have to try that. I'd never even considered doing that. But yeah, so, again, just to kind of, nail this home, there is Saccharomyces cerevisiae. That's the strain of yeast that we are talking about in this episode primarily, because that is known as brewer's yeast. Brewer's yeast is what Fleischmann's uses for their bread yeast. It's what Red Star uses. It is this. Now, what is Saccharomyces cerevisiae? It's a single-celled fungus that belongs to the phylum Ascomycota and has thousands of different strains. So by which I'm saying, when you look, you go to your homebrew store and you see all of these packs of yeast, ale yeast at the very least, that are Saccharomyces cerevisiae, but they all produce different characteristics. That's what I mean. They're all a part of that same Sac cerevisiae family. They're just different, just like we all are, and all technically are referred to either, again, as baker's yeast or brewer's yeast. Now, there is Saccharomyces pastorianus, which is what we refer to as lager yeast. I'm not a microbiologist. I'm not entirely sure how different those are and in what ways, what makes them different. But we know they both do basically the same thing by fermenting wort into beer. And so whatever that is, that's for another episode. But just again, we are talking specifically about Sac cerevisiae, the most commonly used yeast in beer, easily. Well, lager is obviously the most popular beer in the world, but amongst homebrewers and such, we're mostly using that Sac cerevisiae. So,
yep. And I guess the question that's about to be asked, because we're about to talk about it in the next segment, and one that Brian Hall must have asked, is what would happen if you took this brewer's yeast or this baker's yeast and put it in American Pale Ale? And I think it's a worthy question.
Yeah. So I mean, American Pale Ale, the BJCP describes it as an average strength, hop forward, pale American craft beer with sufficient supporting malt to make the beer balanced and drinkable. The clean hop presence can reflect classic or modern American or New World hop varieties with a wide range of characteristics. One of the words in there that is used that really stands out to me is the clean hop presence. And when I hear that, part of what, in my mind at least, makes a beer have a clean hop presence or a clean malt presence is a very clean fermenting yeast. You're not going to take, for example, a Weiss beer yeast strain and use that to make an American Pale Ale. You want that yeast to get in, do its job, and kind of get out of the way and let everything else shine, right?
Exactly. And when you throw in a variable like bread yeast, you get kind of worried because, I mean, there's a lot of unknowns here because I've never used bread yeast. Not 100% sure. I've used a sourdough culture, but not specifically Fleischmann's bread yeast to ferment a beer. And I mean, are we going to get crazy Belgian-like phenolics? Are we going to get a ton of sulfur? Are we going to get a crazy esters? I mean, bread yeast is made to rise at a temperature of around 75, 80 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you're fermenting it more like traditional ale temps, like 66 Fahrenheit, are you going to have a really long lag time before things kick off? I mean, there's a lot of unknowns and questions here that I'm sure Brian was asking himself before we went into this. So,
well, and you think about, so we know that baker's yeast is brewer's yeast. It's Sac Cerevisiae. But you don't know what it is the most like, relative to what we're aware of in brewer's yeast. Is it more similar to a Chico strain, or does it have the ability to produce the types of esters and phenols that you might expect in, a Belgian ale? Who knows? The way to find out obviously is to test it, and we're going to talk about that in the next segment. But I do wonder, like, has anybody out there ever done the research to see what yeast that is used by brewers, what this bread yeast is most closely aligned with? Have you heard of that at all? Because when I think about fermenting a beer with bread yeast, I've never done it, right? But my mind automatically goes to fusel alcohols. It's gonna ferment hella fast because that's what it was intentionally selected for, was fast fermentation, lots of CO2 production. It's probably gonna be hazy because who cares about a yeast that is known for flocculating and dropping clear when you're using it in bread anyways? You know what I mean?
Yeah, but also, again, all this fermentation with bread is happening at warmer than ale temps. And so what do you do? What happens when you cool that off? What happens when you do it at the temperatures it's made to go with?
Yeah.
And so I immediately go to like yeast temperatures and like, what does that lever do to this yeast? Because that's somewhat of, when we buy it from Imperial, they tell us on the label what kind of the ideal range is, and then we go with that to be safe. But when you're buying Fleischmann's, I mean, we know that we want to make that bread dough rise at around 80 degrees if we can, right?
Yeah.
And so if you start dropping that temp, what does that do to it? Does it help or hurt it? I know with some of the Kvike strains, they talk about if you do it lower than the suggested temp, sometimes you'll get different phenolics or ester profiles than you would get if you did it at higher temps. And so again, totally unknown. So I kind of look at it too, like this could be a potential kind of Kvike-esque situation where it's made to be hot and made to go hot, and it could give you really amazing results, or maybe not. We'll see.
Well, yeah. And, you think about sourdough. I don't know how much, you've been involved in the making of sourdough with your wife, but there is a lot of talk in the sourdough world about cold fermentation, extended cold fermentation. So like you mentioned, when I'm making a loaf of sourdough bread, ideally now I just go with whatever the temperature is in my house, and I'm patient enough at least to wait until the things are ready for me to move on to the next step. But a lot of people will, during their bulk fermentation, will throw it in the fridge and let it go for up to 48 hours on the belief that it is going to increase the complexity, which in this case is that kind of tangy sourdough flavor of the bread by being colder. And in the beer world, that's the opposite. The colder you ferment, ostensibly, the cleaner that beer is going to be. So I'm with you. I do think that it's really interesting to think about that lever of fermentation temperature as well. Maybe it is the case that Fleischmann's or Red Star bread yeast, whatever it is, fermented at regular ale temperatures could be just as clean as something like Chico. And that would be fascinating because who doesn't have access to cheap bread yeast, in their grocery store? So I make beer and I make bread. They're a couple of my favorite things to consume, But again, I've never personally used bread yeast to make a beer, or at least yeast marketed for use in bread. It's all brewer's yeast. That's the part that's so fascinating. Well, we were curious how a beer fermented with store-bought bread yeast would fare and put it to the test. Those results when we're back from this break.
AI agents are everywhere, automating tasks and making decisions at machine speed. But agents make mistakes. Just one rogue agent can do big damage before you even notice. Rubrik Agent Cloud is the only platform that helps you monitor agents, set guardrails, and rewind mistakes, so you can unleash agents, not risk. Accelerate your AI transformation at Rubrik.com. That's RUBRIK.com.
Okay. Only 10 more presents to wrap. You're almost at the finish line. But first... There, the last one. Enjoy a Coca-Cola for a pause that refreshes.
Chilling work can be a chore, especially after a long brew day, but not with the Xchillerator Counterflow Chiller, which can chill a 5-gallon or 19-liter batch of wort in 5 minutes or less, leading to a strong cold break and clear wort in the fermenter. Brewlosophy's Matt Del Fiacco uses the Xchillerator Max and absolutely loves it. In addition to improved chilling efficiency, every Xchillerator comes with a 5-year warranty that covers the entire chiller for manufacturer defects. If you're looking to up your chilling game and a CFC is right for you, head over to xchillerator.com today. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. When I was a kid, I was lucky to have a grandma close by who loved to bake. So I have very, very clear and fond memories of opening packets of Fleischmann's and Red Star yeast, pouring them in warm water to watch them proof, and then watching as they caused the dough to rise once it was all blended together. Well, once I got into brewing, I learned that the yeast I was using to make beer was more or less the same as what I'd been using to make bread with my grandma. Well, a few years ago, contributor Brian Hall decided to scratch that itch by comparing pale ales fermented with either bread yeast or, I say brewer's yeast, they're both called that, but specific, yeast that is specifically designed to ferment beer.
Yeah, and so Brian, I think he had a really great approach. He decided to take a simple pale ale recipe, which is he made a single 10-gallon batch of your Tiny Bottom Pale Ale recipe. So that's exciting. I've been meaning to try that one. And that recipe consists of 77% pale malt, 7% C15, Crystal 15, or Caramel 15, whichever way you want to phrase that. 7% Vienna malt, 6% Victory malt, and 3% of C60. And so he's got the crystals and some Victory in there, which is going to make it a really nice kind of malt forward pale ale, which I think sounds good, although maybe not a modern recipe for the modern times there, Marshall. But still. And so it was pretty simple brew day. It looks like he mashed at about 152 degrees Fahrenheit or 67 C for an hour. And when that was done, he removed the grains and boiled for 60 minutes. At 60 minutes, he added 16 grams of Magnum. At 25 minutes, he added 14 grams of Perle. At 10 minutes, 14 grams of Fuggles. And then rounded out in the last 2 minutes with another 15 grams of Fuggles. So that's, honestly, I kind of like that. It's a really old school, like almost more what I would associate with some English ales, although the Perle is kind of a little mix up. But that sounds like a really nice, like almost English pale ale kind of beer.
So here, a little note on this recipe. Tiny Bottom Pale Ale is one of the first beers that I designed completely on my own. Like I didn't reference anything. This was back before Brewlosophy was a thing. And it was designed, the reason it's called Tiny Bottom Pale Ale, there's a couple of reasons. One is that my son was very small at the time and had a tiny little bottom that, it was just cute, but he loved to come out in the garage and help me brew. And so it was reference to that, but also the first time I made Tiny Bottom Pale Ale was to prop up yeast for a double IPA that I was making called Badonkadonk Pale Ale. So it kind of just fit together. And I just threw this recipe together based on what I had left over in my fridge and in my garage. And when it was on tap, I remember drinking it going, this is so unique. It's just such an interesting flavor. And then these people are coming through my house who aren't, crazy beer nerds like me, and they loved it. So once we started Brewlosophy, I threw it up on the website. And people were like, that is the weirdest recipe. Like there's no Cascade, there's no citrusy hops in it, and it does not have any of the fruity flavors. I've never once wanted a beer to taste more like fruit. It just doesn't have any of that. And so it's very simple. It's a very basic beer that I think is really approachable, that doesn't taste like, a Budweiser. It's a good gateway beer for your friends out there. That's part of the reason that I kept it going. And I keep hearing feedback from people who are saying the same thing. Yeah, it's really unique. It's definitely not your classic, fruity American pale ale, but it does have kind of, English vibes mixed with a little bit of that American crispness. So I keep going with it. I absolutely love it.
No, I think it sounds delicious. Maybe not a modern pale ale, but it's definitely one for the ages, as we can see. So when the boil was complete, the wort was chilled and evenly split between two identical fermenters. And at this point, we have a refractometer reading, and it showed to be around 10, not refractometer, looks like it was a hydrometer, but 1054 OG. So yeah, really nice, kind of, what you would expect for a nice pale ale. It was at this point that both worts were stabilized to desired fermentation temperature, so of 65 degrees Fahrenheit or 18C, and so one was pitched with 2 packs of Fleischmann's active dry bread yeast, while the other one received 2 packs of SAF Ale US-05 American ale yeast. Both were rehydrated before pitching. So I think this is cool. I think keeping them at 65 degrees Fahrenheit is probably a good idea for this particular variable because, again, you're trying to keep things somewhat level. But as I mentioned earlier, like that's the one lever here that to me is kind of an X factor is the fermentation temperature because, again, with this USO5, it's going to be nice and clean at 65F or 18C. But with bread yeast, I really don't know what it's going to do at 65 Fahrenheit or 18C. I just know that it's going to ferment some floury bread dough like gangbusters at about 80 degrees Fahrenheit.
Yeah, here's the thing. I remember when we were going back and forth I was so stoked that Brian agreed to do this. It's not common that people out there are willing to risk having to dump a 5-gallon batch of beer. That's what Brewlosophy is kind of known for, is we'll take that risk. We'll dump it if we have to. And so, he split this. The wort is identical. I love his design here. He made this 10-gallon batch, split it evenly. One got the same exact amount of Fleischmann's yeast as the other got, SAF Ale US-05 yeast. Beautiful design. This is going to show us at the very least how similar and or different, this bread yeast is from the most popular American ale strain out there. And so it's going to be fascinating. Now, my expectations, as I was talking with Brian about this while he's designing the experiment and as he's doing it, was, will this bread yeast actually take off in the way that the brewer's yeast does? They're both Saxervisiae, so I was kind of in the camp of yeast is going to yeast. It's going to ferment that wort. But, they all have their different characteristics and ways of doing things. Well, sure enough, the next day, Brian's messaging the group going, yeah, they're both fermenting. They look the same. There's no difference yet. He said they smelled pretty much the same. I mean, fermentation kind of has a pretty basic smell. So it was at the start, it's like, wow, okay, things are going in a very similar direction at this point. This is where things start to pick up for us, right? Is fermentation. What's going to happen next? Is something different going to take place? So yeah, really exciting stuff here.
Yeah, I'm really impressed that both beers showed signs of fermentation within like 24 hours. That's amazing to me. That kind of gives you a little bit of hope that things are going to go well and that 66F isn't too cold, or 65F 18C isn't too cold for all this. Anyways, he chose to let these beers sit for 10 days before taking any other hydrometer measurements. And then after 10 days, he took a reading, and the bread yeast finished at a pretty nice 1009 FG, and the beer yeast finished at 1015. So the bread yeast was slightly more attenuative than the beer yeast, which is also very fascinating.
Quite a bit more attenuative, if you ask me. I mean, 6 specific gravity points in the same amount of time. Anybody who's used USO5 knows that it is what I like about it is that it doesn't over attenuate, right? It's not going to dry a beer out in the way that, say, a wine yeast would, which, by the way, wine yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, it's just a different strain. So again, how close is bread yeast to wine yeast? That's another good question. And so, yeah, to see this, I'm going, wow, maybe the bread yeast did get in there and get out of the way. I mean, it was selected because of how quickly it ferments. Was it done in less than the week, that it took for that Brian let those beers sit and ferment? Who knows? But it beat in terms of attenuation. It's ahead of the brewer's yeast at this point.
Yeah, and I'm kind of curious here too, because he did 2 packages, and I don't really know off the top of my head how much a Fleischmann's active dry yeast package weighs versus a pack of USO5. So, was it, because again, they took off really fast, but was there kind of a little bit more bread yeast in there? Did having that really active fermentation drive it down a little further? I don't know. But that's kind of an interesting observation here, at least with the gravity points.
Well, to answer that question, so my wife, like I said earlier, my wife bought a jar of the yeast, but that was because we ran out of our pack. You get the packets. It's like in a 3-pack of 3 packs.
Right.
I do think that brewer's yeast, this is off the top of my head, I could be wrong on this. I think brewer's yeast, like USO5, is 11 grams of yeast, and I think the Fleischmann's is 7 grams, either 7 or 11 as well. I forget. But, Brian made the decision that he did based off of his observations of that. So I have to trust that he made the decision was well thought out.
Yeah. Fair enough. So at this point, the beers were pressure transferred to CO2 purged kegs, placed on gas in Brian's Keezer, and after a week of cold conditioning, they were carbonated and ready for evaluation. So let's talk about how this thing looks, because I got the pictures up right now, and I have to say, I thought the Fleischmann's Baker yeast would be a lot hazier than what it is in this picture. They kind of look almost identical, in my opinion.
I'm looking at these photos right now, and they look like commercially bright beers to me. I mean, they are all of them, but both of the brewer's yeast and the bread yeast beers look identical in my opinion. Golden yellow color, stark white cap of foam, but they are both so bright. And I mean, this was the first point where I was like, yeah, all right, fermentation, attenuation, that all sort of makes sense. It tracks with what I was thinking. The fact that the beer that was fermented with Fleischmann's bread yeast turned out that clear and wasn't just a hazy mess, right off the bat, I'm thinking I was already wrong in my expectations.
Yeah, there might be some potential here. And so normally whenever we do these things, we like to do our own triangle test and give our own impressions before serving it to tasters. And so in this one, Brian did his own set of semi-blind triangle tests where, again, we're knowledgeable of the variable, but we're just doing our own triangle test where either someone else is serving it or we have a way to obfuscate which of the different cups are. And then we do 5, typically we do 5 or so triangle tests. So we're semi-blind to the variable, but we know that something's different, but we still blind ourselves to what we're drinking. And so he went every single blind triangle test Brian did, he was correct, noting the beer that was fermented with Saf Ale USO5 was a bit muddled with lacking enthusiasm, while the one fermented with Baker's yeast tasted more like a poorly executed Belgian ale, which I find both of these descriptions, because some 05 beers will taste muddled, lacking enthusiasm, and I'm impressed that the Baker's yeast tasted like a poorly executed Belgian ale. That's a little interesting.
So Brian and I had a really, what I thought was a fairly humorous and lighthearted conversation about this. His comment that the beer fermented with USO5 was a bit muddled with lacking enthusiasm was a dig at my tiny bottom pale ale, and he did that intentionally. This is a guy he was on, in my opinion, Brian and a handful of other East Coasters at the time. He was living in Maine when he and I first started coordinating, and it was right around the time he joined Brewlosophy, but he ended up moving to Alaska where he lives today. Out there at the time, hazy IPA, or what was being called New England IPA, was blowing up, and Brian was at the forefront of that. So this is a guy who's known for making these hyper fruity, super enthusiastic, in his words, beers. Tiny Bottom Pale Ale is the exact opposite of that, first off. Secondly, I'd never fermented it with US-05. I used WLP 090 San Diego Super Yeast, which I've found is kind of necessary for that beer to have the character that I like so much in it. You can use other yeasts, of course. I have fermented it with Flagship, which ostensibly is the same as US-05, but that was kind of his fun poke at how he thought the Tiny Bottom recipe was pretty boring. And if you are the type who does not like real basic beers, don't make Tiny Bottom. Trust me, it is very, very basic. The funny thing to me, though, is how, like you said, how he described the one made with the baker's yeast as being a poorly executed Belgian ale. That's how I describe homebrew flavor. Like like when somebody says, "Oh, it's got that homebrew flavor," to me, it is usually some form of a contamination or poor fermentation process, and it results in just a slightly phenolic, not overly phenolic, but kind of a slightly phenolic flavor with maybe some weird Perry esters in there. They're not supposed to be there in a beer like Tiny Bottom Pale Ale. So the fact that he that's how he experienced it. I mean, I think obviously I'm going into this after his impressions going, well, God, I mean, chances are tasters are going to pick this up as well. But anyways, fascinating and more humorous descriptions from Brian there.
Yeah, I think my next Belgian I enter in competition is going to be called Poorly Executed Belgian Ale, and just see what it does. So the experiment results, we had 20 participants, so we would expect 11 to get it right if it was going to be significant, and we actually got 12 tasters that got it right. So it was a significant experiment and we can say with some certainty, at least in this particular experiment, that tasters could reliably tell these beers apart. But
the fact that just 12 out of 20 found it, were able to distinguish these beers. That means that 8 weren't, or didn't at the very least. Now that we can't speak to that. We're not trying, I don't want to extrapolate from this, but I would have expected it to be most everybody could tell these beers apart if it was that different, right? So seeing these results, when they came in live, right? When Brian's like, all right, I'm done collecting my data. What are the results? I was just like, wow. I expected way more people to be able to tell these beers apart.
I would have expected it to be kind of a home run, because whenever I go 5 for 5 on my blind triangles, I'm usually expecting at least up 18 out of 20 or so tasters for the experiment. But things happen, palates vary, and bias is a thing. So that's kind of where it lands. But preference, this is the one that always throws me off, because you're like, how many really would prefer the one that's the poorly executed Belgian ale? Well, 4 did. 4 preferred the poorly executed Belgian ale. 7 liked the one fermented with a normal beer yeast, and 1 said they had no preference despite perceiving a difference. So I would have thought it would have leaned a lot more to the beer yeast, but maybe it was much more interesting to go with the Fleischmann's bread yeast beer. I don't know. Yeah.
Fascinating. Now, just a reminder, when we ask tasters for which one they prefer, we're only asking the people who got the triangle test right. We ask everybody, but the people who got the triangle test wrong, they go to a fake comparison of the 2 beers that are identical, that's funny data in and of itself, because some people will be like, oh, I loved this one, more than the other. They're identical beers. In this case, though, 4 out of 12 people saying they liked the beer fermented with bread yeast. Those 4 people, in the end, if they were brewers, should just go buy some Fleischmann's and make some beer with it, because that is just crazy to me that bread. Maybe it's not that crazy. They're both Sac Cerevisiae. They're both in that same family. They are both technically brewer's yeast, so yes. But man, it's sitting right there on the store shelves. Throw some of that into some wort, and you can make a drinkable beer. I don't know if Brian ended up dumping, the either of these batches. He wasn't the biggest fan of either of them. They sure were pretty, though. That's for sure. And the fact that 4 people liked the one made with bread yeast, I'd at the very least just given them bottles of it, so I didn't have to toss it.
Please take this keg. Please, for the love of all that is holy, take this keg.
Exactly. So, in the end, I guess we could say that fermenting with bread yeast, which, it is brewer's yeast, it works. And though it may not always be the best option, it is an option that brewers have to them if they want to explore something. Maybe if they want to have some experimental batch on tap. I think that's pretty cool. Now, we do have some reader comments we're going to get to. The first one comes from Rudy, who says, when I was in Saudi Arabia for Desert Storm, I got my hands on some bread yeast and pure grape juice from a local canteen. It wasn't the best wine, quote in quotes, but it did work in a pinch in a dry country. I think that's pretty awesome.
Yeah, I think there's a slang term for that called hooch. So
we call it pruno in prison. Yeah.
Pruno, hooch, yeah. Something.
And it's actually, it's funny you bring that up, because the cleanest way that it's made, I've asked inmates over the years how they do it, is they take raw dough from the kitchen and they'll pitch that into the juice and they get fermentation that way. So next comment comes from Jason, who says, I too like to bake bread. So what about using brewer's yeast to ferment bread? Is that something you've tried before, Will?
I've never tried it before. Technically, it should work. Again, I wonder about temperature and all of this. Like, I hate to sound like I'm beating a dead horse and I keep talking about temperature, but that's really the X factor to me. We know that yeast will go through and they'll chew up all those fermentable sugars that are available. And so maybe you just need a little bit longer time to let it rise. Maybe the little bit higher temperatures would give you something. But yeah, I don't think there's any problem with using brewer's yeast to make bread. I think it would work fine.
Yeah, I've never done it, but I know people who have. Being in the sourdough world long enough, you kind of start crossing paths with people who also brew and who've tried this. From what I've heard, again, this is not personal experience. This is just anecdote from other people. Brewer's yeast will tend to be quite a bit slower. I hate saying that because it's technically the same thing. Yeast typically used for beer will generally be a little bit slower to ferment that loaf, the dough. So it's going to rise slower. You might want to warm it up a little bit more, but that flavor wise, it doesn't really have that much of an impact, which makes sense to me. I mean, I'd be really curious to see, if you were to use something like a Weissbier strain to ferment bread, would you have a bread that's full of isoamyl acetate, banana flavor? I don't think that's going to be the case, but I don't know why it wouldn't either. So that definitely something that I should try as both a baker and a brewer. I think it would be really interesting. So perhaps that's in the future. And if I do that, I'll be sure to share it. All right. Final comment comes from Tiago Zolet, who says, when I tried using Fleischmann's, so it sounds like he fermented a beer with Fleischmann's as well, I got the same phenolics that you described, but what I observed was that lag time was way faster compared to using USO5. Then I tried to bake using bake using USO5. It turned out great, but this time the lag phase to rise the dough is way longer using that compared to using bread yeast. So there you have it. Tiago's saying that when he tried to make a loaf of bread using USO5, it just took longer to rise, but the bread came out great. On the opposite end, just like with Brian's beers, it sounds like when he fermented a beer with bread yeast, that it did have some of those same, how did he describe it, as a poorly executed Belgian ale characteristics?
Yeah, I would think this lines up again. They're isolated for very different reasons, and one's made to do a certain job, and the other's made to do another job. And bread yeast is just super efficient at what it does because that's what it's made to do. Because you're not really drinking it, you're just it's there to create some CO2 and ferment some flour out. So that lines up with what I would think.
Yep, absolutely. Me too. And that is all of the time that we've got for this episode. If you happen to go out there and make a beer using bread yeast or bread using beer yeast, please let us know. Hit us up with some feedback. I would love to know how it turns out for you. Do you have any final words before we wrap things up, Will?
If I really decide that I hate myself, maybe I'll do a temp comparison with Fleischmann's brewer's yeast. I don't know. Maybe it's the panacea. Maybe if I get it up to 80 degrees and treat it more like a Weich, we'll get like a nice clean beer. But we'll see how much I hate myself and if I really want to go through with that.
Or if you actually make a Belgian beer and ferment it with, Fleischmann's bread yeast, will that be less poorly executed? Who knows? But that is what we've got for us coming in the future. I'm sure some of us are going to, or at least one of us will mess around with that. All right. Don't forget to check out the rad brewing content Martin's creating over at the Brewlosophy Show, which you can subscribe to at youtube.com/@the Show. That's the @ symbol followed by the Brewlosophy Show with no umlaut. And as always, you can read more about the experiment we discussed by clicking the link to the article on brewlosophy.com in the description of this episode. The Brulosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brulosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brulosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brulosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey cause it suits my bro. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more.